available still from last week, which is entitled June 9 Sunday. And we'll be looking or finishing up, as I said last week, Exodus chapter 21, mostly chapter 22. Now, laws are always important in any kind of society. What's the purpose of law in a society? If you have a good reason for it, why we need it. I know it's kind of a philosophical question, but go ahead, Dan. To maintain civility, okay? Because, and particularly in this environment, why would it be so important with this group? Yeah. Sure. Mm-hmm. Right. So, situations are going to arise, and there needs to be justice, and there also at times needs to be restitution. And why would that, again, with a group of people, I know it's a little difficult for us to picture this group of hundreds of thousands of people, and generally together, again, try to look at it from that perspective. Anybody want to take a shot at that? It's not a real, go ahead, Edwina.
You have that many people and you don't have a law about a certain thing that happens. There's all these different ideas
Sure.
and everything, and then factions, and
Sure.
it just leads to a lot of disruptions.
Yeah, I think if people don't perceive that there's fairness, then in a group like this, one would think you could easily have people getting aroused and there being problems that are brought to the whole group. So that's a good point. What else? Yes, John, whatever your name is. Sure. James.
I think that being in Egypt for as long as they were, they acclimated themselves to that environment, religiously, politically, whatever they've been. And where they're wandering, especially when they come up with other inhabitants of other places, especially in Canaan, they're going to have different viewpoints on this and that, different laws, different. Whatever.
Sure. Now that we're out there free and.
So it's important that they have, trying to separate yourself from how the Egyptians look at it or these people that look at it. This is how God looks at it.
Right.
Because I think the theme especially later on, what happens is like in the book of Judges where it says, people did what was right in their own eyes, and so that kind of goes against, the whole idea of law because, if you look at it God's way, there's only the one way to look at it, whereas when you have that idea, especially in Judges when so much stuff is going on, when they look at it in their own way, they usually veer off the path.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because it needed to be established, I think, from the perspective of they've been under Egyptian law, such as it was. I suspect they probably governed themselves in their own little groups from time to time. But nevertheless, they've been living there amongst the Egyptians and what they wanted. It was very important to clarify. I mean, I suspect some of these things would have been just as true amongst Egyptians as it would be true amongst any people. There are a few things here that wouldn't be. They're related more to the God that they worship. But nevertheless, there needs to be order, and people need to know where they stand. And in order to be able to do that, we need to have some kind of law. So I thought that was, for me at least, why it was important to go over these, even though in some ways it might seem like it's not really worth our time. But I think when you see the things that are written here, it seems like God tries to cover in just about every situation related to certain situations. What happens if your ox gets out of control? What happens if a human being gets out of control? I mean, people need to know there are going to be consequences for it, because I think what James says is true. There would be this tendency for them to think, okay, we're out. I mean, they have leadership, don't they? I mean, they have Aaron and they have Moses and Miriam to a point. And so they do have guidance. I mean, it's there. But people like to know when we're interacting with one another, we want to know just what it is we're supposed to be doing and what we can't be doing to a great extent. Or we go to the other extreme and we just want to be a law unto ourselves, like James is talking about. Oh, sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Adding to what James was talking about, it seems to me that, remember when God was angry with the people and he said, I'm going to destroy these people and I'll raise up a new group of people under you, Moses.
Right.
Well, Moses explained that he didn't see that as right because these are God's people. And what would the world think, or what would Egypt think? You brought them out of Egypt, and now you brought them out to destroy them. So there's kind of that idea out there. But they were God's people, and they needed to honor God. And God said, "You obey me, and you will be my people." So that was part of it too. It seemed like God wanted His people to stand out. They were different, and then His law is the way that they kept the
Right.
whatever that word David said was the peace of the people there.
What was the word you used? Do you remember, Dave? Civility. There you go.
Civility.
Yeah.
Word of the day.
Okay. All right, good. I just want us to understand that it's important for people to know what they're supposed to do. We're just like that. We get into a situation and we're out with a group of people and immediately, maybe we're camping or something like that, and well, what are we supposed to do? What are going to be our rules here? Because we can't stay up all night and we can't just go around kicking one another in the shins. So we need to know. Now, some of that behavior is going to be somewhat self-evident. I mean, there's a way to treat people because remember, the thing that covers these laws are what? The things that cover these laws are the idea that we're supposed to do. What? Love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and what else? Yeah, okay. So, with that in mind, that's what these details are. I mean, it would be nice to just say that's all there is to it. Treat your neighbor the right way, and I think probably a lot of people would be willing to do that. I mean, when you have a group of people who want to submit themselves to other people, that right there creates a certain amount of ease and people getting along. But nevertheless, there were going to be things that needed to be well known given the circumstances in which they were living. So down in question number 5, it says, list the laws regarding a sheep or an ox. Now, I think this helps us to understand. I mean, obviously, they would have livestock, mainly oxen and sheep. So he says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. Okay, now, how does this sound different than how we tend to look at these kinds of things? Yeah, go ahead. What do you mean by that, Dan?
Okay, so if I crash into your car, I
Right.
have to make it completely right. I don't have to just buy you another car.
Okay.
This is to make it equal.
Okay, so there's restitution. This is what you've done to me.
Equal restitution.
Okay, all right. Now, so what happens if someone steals something? What do we normally expect to happen to someone who steals something? We talk about it all the time when we see people going all over and around tearing up streets. Restitution, but no.
Sometimes a little extra time in the
That's usually what happens. Usually, you go to jail, theoretically, when we hold people accountable. But I mean, that's the way we tend to do it. And I think when you look at the whole idea from looking at it from the point of view of restitution, that makes people responsible, rather than, well, when do I get out of here? Without having any responsibility. Sometimes people are told that they need to make restitution. But that was the fundamental part of it. He says if a thief is caught while breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there will be no blood guiltness on his account. Now, why does that sound right to you? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we generally have laws like that in our society. If you try to break into my house, then I have a the right to protect my home. All right. We know that in our society, though, sometimes even that can kind of get you in trouble. But nevertheless, it makes perfect sense. So if the guy comes in, he's taking a chance like this, he wants to do you harm, well, if he gets shot or stabbed, that's his business. If the sun has risen on him, there will be guiltiness on his account, and he shall surely make restitution. In other words, if he doesn't get killed, then what happens? Then he has to pay back and take care of the restitution. For if what he stole is actually found alive in his possession, now this is another question that comes into this. What if he still got the stuff? Whether an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. So he's going to have to figure that one out. Now, the whole idea of law is to hopefully put in people's minds, you shouldn't hurt other people because you're not going to be able to do it without there being something negative that happens to you. So you can see how that works this way. And again, try to picture these people in their position there that they are in, wandering, if you will, traveling through the desert before they get to where, what I talked about this morning in Numbers chapter 13, before they actually arrive there. And these laws are going to fit quite well for them. Now, let's go ahead and look at the question number 6. It says, from this text, list the laws of restitution. So I ask you to list the ones that are there that fit the things that are going to be most helpful to them in terms of, okay, people cannot do harm to people. If they do, then there must be restitution for it. Okay, so Vance, would you read 5 and 6? So this tells you what's the general way of life for these people in terms of how do they exist and how do they do business. Yeah, that's true. But what generally, how does this look here when it says, if a man lets a field or a vineyard? That sounds like what? Agriculture. So that's pretty much what they're going to be. Most people at that particular time were. Certainly people who are nomadic. So it says, because it talks about if he grazes it bare and lets his animal loose so that it grazes in another man's field. So you can kind of picture this in your mind. You know, I've got my animals and they're over there, and Charlie's got his piece of land, and after all the grass is gone on mine, I just kind of cut a hole in the fence and they wander over to Charlie's place. All right, that may sound like, I could probably pretty easily say, oh, well, I didn't mean to do that, But if I understand that that's something that I have to do, and so then what's important is that I'm careful that grass is important to me, and my neighbor's grass is important to him to feed his animals. So it's important, I think, as we look at that. And then if a fire breaks out, it spreads to thorn bushes, and then it gets into product when it says gets into standing grain on the field, or the field itself is consumed. He who started the fire shall surely make restitution. If a man gives his neighbor money or goods to keep for him, I just find some of these very, very interesting, some of these. I'm thinking, I just don't know that I would have thought of this one. But if a man gives his neighbor money or goods to keep for him, and it is stolen from the man's house, if the thief is caught, he shall pay double. So it's the thief who has to pay. But if somebody's storing something at your house, how do you feel about that generally? If Edwin has got something over at my house and it gets stolen, yeah, I would feel bad about it. Yeah, and what are you saying there, Jackie?
That the loss will still be on the person.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not my laws. All right, now, so it goes on to say, um, if the thief is not caught, then the owner of the house shall appear before the judges to determine whether he laid his hands on his neighbor's property. Aha. We're going to find out whether this person's a little underhanded, and they're the ones who did it. Maybe told a story about who had broken into his house or whatever it may have been, into places where they would keep their stock. So, in other words, it was trying to understand, I mean, what do we know about people now based as God views people, based on this estimation of people? What does he know about people? Yeah, and people can be underhanded. And even though these are God's people, he knows that it's possible for them. So, realizing that's true, sometimes if something like this happens, then sometimes a judge, remember who the judges are? The ones appointed by Moses. Remember when his father-in-law saw that there were just too many issues for him to handle on his own, and so they had judges to take care of that. Okay, so let's go ahead and read 9 and 10. 9 and 10. Daniel Stitt, would you read that, please? Daniel?
9 and 10.
Yeah, 9 and 10.
For every breach of trust, whether it is for an ox, for a donkey, for a sheep, for a cloak, for any kind of lost thing, of which one says, "This is it." The case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God condemns shall pay double to his neighbor.
Okay, so again, it's a sense of fairness then that we're shooting for, isn't it? So if a man, it says a breach of trust, whether it is for an ox or for a donkey or for a sheep, or for anything about which one says, "This is it, this is mine," the case of both parties shall come before the judge. In other words, they can't agree on whose animals they are. I mean, whose are they anyway? Okay, again, important. Think about the purpose of this. This is, I think, what makes this time useful in going over this, is to understand that God didn't just put these people out without having laws to regulate what they were doing. Now, what do we generally, when we think about these people and their laws, what are the laws that we generally concern ourselves with? The Ten Commandments. That's pretty much, what we look at. And those are fairly general. They don't get into a whole lot of details, if this, if that. But there are times when certain laws have to be, they have to be defined. Here's what it means to do wrong when it comes to taking things from people or losing things from people. All of that's, very, very important for us all to understand and for them to understand. And it's the same kind of laws that generally are in our society today. They may not be taken as seriously, but nevertheless, they're there. Okay, so this is, I think, very, very important considering the context in which all these things are happening. Chapter 22, verse 21 through 24. Let's see. Mark, would you read that, please? 21 to 24. The question is, what should happen to one who punishes a stranger, widow, or orphan? Okay, go ahead, Mark.
Do not mistreat an alien or oppress him, or you worry him as an injury. Do not take advantage of a widow or an orphan. If you do, and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with my sword. Your wives will become widows, and your children fatherless.
Is that it? Okay. What's God's concern here? What do you learn about God in this particular context? Okay, they're not to be treated as people. We're assuming these are people who would have kind of wandered into the camp or something like that.
Reminded of what happened to Lot when the men came in and they
Yeah, because they're strangers.
They're under my control.
Yeah, right,
I'm responsible for them.
right. So he understood the principle, and he would hope that the guys there in Sodom would have thought the same or would have understood the same. Yeah, go ahead, Dana.
I think the other thing you see is that God cares for and protects the widow and
Okay.
the father.
Okay, that's really where this really hits for us all. Regardless of laws, we always have to remember what? That God really cares for those who can't take care of themselves. And that's why when it says, when you treat them that way, it comes to me and I will see that something's done about it. And maybe he does something personally about it. I don't know of a situation in the camp or when they're wandering out here that something like that happened. But nevertheless, God wanted them to be able to do what? Put other people into what perspective? The same perspective that they had when they were in Egypt. They were the people who were the victim of the strong people. Remember what it's like when you were weak, when you were needy. And I think it's amazing to me that is so, in a situation where one might think that, okay, when we're laying out laws, that, they got to be equal. I guess that's the way. This person gets punishment, and so does another. I don't know if it's specifically if that's what the consideration is here, but nevertheless, as we notice, if that person is a person who's poor or a person who's a stranger, like Larry said, then that person should not be abused. And that, again, is pointing to the sinful way people can behave toward other people. It's a little bit like, the classic, I think, illustration of this for me is there's some little kid in school and doesn't look right or doesn't dress right or whatever it may be, and then, the big tough guys, show how tough they really are, and then they go, push this girl or boy around. And almost all of us, look at that and we say, if they were our children, I would hope we would be very upset about something like that happening. And I think that's what God says. If you see that kind of behavior, then understand that I see it. It's like what God is saying, this sticks out like a sore thumb to me. So don't allow it to happen. So why does that work well in an environment like this? Just generally speaking. Here we are, a bunch of people, and we're trying to figure out ways to get along. What will this illuminate?
Well, if you're staying like in the schoolyard with the kids, when they realize that somebody is watching what's
Yeah.
going on, they're going to know that there are, you're going to get their
Yeah. That's the way it ought to work. They know somebody's watching, and what God is saying is that I'm watching. For some people, that's not all that impressive, but nevertheless, I think generally speaking, your average child bully thinks they're getting away with something when they're doing it, and if somebody else sees them, then they act like they're not doing it. God says, I see it. I see it. All right, now we're going to kind of cross over into another aspect of this down in chapter 22, because now it's talking about loaning money. Let's see. Go ahead, Christina. Read 25 through 28, please.
If you lend money to any of my people who are needy among you, do not be like a money lender to him. Do not charge him interest. If you do take the garment of your neighbor in pledge, you must return it to him by the time the sun goes down. For it is his only covering, it is his garment for his body. What else can he sleep in? And when he cries out to me, I will hear, for I am gracious.
Okay, so generally speaking, most of us understand that if I borrow money from a bank, I'm going to get charged interest. That's just the way it works. It's a business deal. What about one another, and loaning money and charging interest. What do you think about that? They were told not to, which indicates that there's a principle there. I have never heard, no, I won't say I have not heard. I've heard at times people borrow money and insist on paying interest. Okay, so that does happen. But most times, people will try to talk them out of it. And, yeah, and most of us, the way we approach it, in fact, generally speaking, when we're helping other people, particularly amongst our brethren, we want to help them because they need help. That's why we want to do it. It's not because we're in the business of trying to get a little extra money when we offer such help. But nevertheless, it's one of those things where I think for the most part, my experience here amongst people is that when somebody needs money and somebody gives them money, it is a gift. Now, the people might want to pay it back if they're able to pay it back, but whenever we help in any benevolent situation, it's there. It shouldn't be considered to be a loan, because, why would that, make some of you uncomfortable, even though it may not specifically be condemned? Any thoughts?
It's easy to borrow from a bank. You don't see those people every day. You don't think of them as family. They're just a bank.
Yeah.
That's their job.
Right.
Borrowing money from somebody here and then having to see them on Sundays and Wednesdays and
Sure.
that you
Well, that's a
can't
good
pay
point.
them back, it's a little uncomfortable. I mean, whether they ask you to pay them back or not, it's still a little uncomfortable.
It can be, but I think the way I think it's generally been approached here is that when we help, and individually, I'm talking about individually as well as the church, we have no desire to put pressure upon people, even though a person might feel uncomfortable. If a person needs help, then that person should be helped. It's just that simple.
Well, when you look at what happened in Acts, when they all came together and they put everything together and they said, whoever needs anything,
Yeah.
they can get it.
Dan is talking about Acts chapter 2 up through chapter 4, how they put things together. Go ahead, Larry.
Historically, I think this passage has been misused by some that say that you can't charge interest in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, some may have said that, yes.
It's not talking about usury as a business expense.
Right.
It's talking about the poor, and I think that's why it comes right after this
Right.
mention of widows and orphans. When those that are in need, and it talks about this cloak, well, how do they know that this is the only cloak that people have? Because they're poor, they don't have anything
Yeah.
else. They have no method.
Right.
And when we look at this world, if I can rant for just a second, we see these quick loan places where people have nothing, they can take a quick loan, but the interest is so much that they can never pay it back.
Yeah.
And God says, that's not how you treat people.
Yeah, we shouldn't be doing that. I mean, we don't like it when businesses do it at that level. And, the sad part of that, when they go in there and somebody's charging them 20 or 30% or something like that, and sometimes higher.
They didn't charge them to eat from the edge of their fields that they had to leave there for them to eat.
Yeah, that's true. That's another situation. I think when a person's in that sort of a situation, this person that Larry's describing back there, they don't even ask what the interest is. I mean, they're so desperate. I mean, 'cause I've seen them, when I've gone in there and when I used to send money to the Philippines through one of these agencies because they handled Western Union, and I would see people come in and borrow money. And it was a really, really sad thing. But I never heard anyone say, okay, how much is this going to cost me? All they need is the money now. Now, maybe their fault, I understand how that works. But let's go on back to Larry's point about the cloak. Now, clearly, poor people need a cloak. But I do think there's a certain sense here when it's talking about anybody who's got a cloak. And so, why would it be important? I'll let you pursue this if you want, Larry. Why would it be important to make sure that a person at the end of his day has his cloak?
I think it's talking about not just because you need it because it's cold outside, but it's
Sure.
And everything is out of your control.
Right. And so the person who's in the power position must understand that. And so, I mean, you'll find descriptions of this. You know, one of the things about cloaks was that they not only were important to the poor and to those who had things, wealthy or whatever, however you might describe them. I don't know how people at this point were really developing a lot of wealth as they were wandering along. But they weren't easy to make. You know, you just didn't say, oh, well, okay, I can't get it back from Charlie because, you know, he took my cloak, so I'll just go down here to Marshall's and get myself another coat. It wasn't going to be that easy. So think about, and as Larry says, particularly the poor. Think about them. If you can see where you can get them and really hurt them, this is the way you can really hurt them and really be treating them poorly. So I think when he's providing this to us for one of the fundamental basic rules, okay, number one, you know, I don't know how people in that particular situation, I don't know what circumstances would cause them to need money. I mean, I think I can understand how this rule would have certainly applied even as time went along. And there probably were situations, but for the most part, they come out of Egypt with the stuff that they had as much as they could carry. And then they came out, some of them came out pretty good with some of the stuff that they carried with them, some gems and different things like that. So, but nevertheless, the focus here is on the poor people. Don't take advantage of them. And make sure, this person, it may be the only thing that they have. Don't take that from them. By the end of the day, they should have that cloak again. So again, it's this God's compassion for people, which, you know, is so clear here. Question number 9. This is, I think, something to consider, because the question is asked, whom should you not curse? You feel like reading, Jack? Yeah, 22, chapter 22, verse 28 through 30.
Got it.
Okay?
You shall not curse God, nor curse the ruler of your people. You shall not delay the offering from your harvest and your vintage. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days. On the 8th day you will give it to me, and you shall be holy men to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh torn to pieces in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs.
Okay, it starts out by saying you shall not curse God. I think we understand when we're talking about cursing that we're not talking about swearing at them. We're talking about speaking in a way where we're kind of reviling that individuals. So who are we not supposed to curse? God for starters.
Your parents.
Yeah. Nor curse a ruler of your people. Now, why would that be important under these circumstances again? Yeah. Yeah, don't make it hard for a person who's ruling. I mean, I could just kind of imagine how this thought works, is that this is a challenging situation that we're in out here. There's going to be judgments that are going to be made. And people need to accept what the judge says in this case. So don't curse, as it says there. Don't say bad things. Don't put them down. Try to do everything you can. Recognize that, I mean, do you think there would be disputes about some of the stuff that we brought up? Sure, you know, who stole my ox? What did my ox do when it got in your backyard and destroyed something? You know, people have a tendency to do what in those kinds of situations? Whose fault is it? Yeah, it's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault. So you have that, don't you, Barbara? This is just the way it works. So even though I maybe let my ox out and it did damage to my neighbor, my thought would be, well, it's your fault. You know, you should have been watching out for my ox. I mean, that's just the way we are. That's how pathetic we can be in these situations because, well, as Barbara says, it's always the other guy. And if it's always the other guy, then what? Then it means that if you don't get the ruling in the way you want the ruling to be, you're going to get mad. That's what most people do. And so when you get mad, what's the thing that's most likely to happen? Yeah. Usually we get a bit out of control. It's very easy to get out of control in those sorts of situations. So again, it's just a fundamental rule. You got people, you don't curse God. And I mean, is he putting it on the same level as rulers and God? What do you think? Yeah, go ahead, Gene.
That's what I asked. Does your verse say with God, capital G, or does it say the God?
I don't know. I haven't looked.
Talking about rulers.
Well, I've got capital G. But anyway, I'm not sure that, you know, that it really matters. I mean, obviously, it makes more sense for it to be the capital G, don't we think? I mean, because don't curse the gods, the idols. Yeah, so I think it would make probably a little bit more sense. But I haven't checked the Hebrew on that to understand specifically. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I have the Hebrew Greek Study Bible, and they use gods, and when I looked it up, it meant God, as in God.
Uh-huh.
And because it had couple different meanings, but it had God, it had judges, and it had angels.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are specific names for God, but there are also terms that can be multiply used that can refer also to other individuals. You raising your hand for him, or were you?
No.
Okay, go ahead.
I think also we're talking about authority here, and that
Right.
we need to respect authority, even though we may not agree with it. I mean, none of us like to get pulled over to get a
Sure.
ticket from the policeman.
Right.
But we have to respect the fact that he has the authority to do that.
Right.
And then by law, we have to follow the law regarding that. But that's what we're talking about here, whether
Right.
it's God in heaven or a ruler here on earth. They have authority, and we must learn to respect it.
And I think what's being made there by Carol is a really, really good point. If you are going to be able to have order, there's got to be orderliness. And that means that there has to be desire to try to get along and to try to find ways to work things out. And specifically in this situation, it was very, very important. There's certain things you could think of, okay, be sure that you're careful with those who are poor. But also, just generally, what you need to remember is don't curse God. Which I think is understandable. And there could be other intonations of that. But nevertheless, God is the one who is ordaining these laws. And the rulers are supposed to be the ones who are supposed to be carrying this out. So respect them. Because if you don't, I mean, what happens in our culture today? Do people, we recognize that a lot of people just don't respect the law? It's become a very common thing. And in some places, it makes it dangerous for people to get around. Now, in Bakersfield, I think we're generally very, very blessed. But in big cities, this has become a real problem. Okay, now, let's look down at the last one about the firstborn. Chapter 20, Jack went ahead and I had you read through 30, didn't I, Jack? Okay, go ahead and read 31. Finish it off. Of chapter 22.
And you shall be holy men to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh torn to pieces in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs.
Okay, so that's, why do you think something like that gets put in here? Well, there certainly would be laws of cleanliness that I think would be important. But he says, if you just find, I guess if you go out and find roadkill, this is not something you should be eating. And so he says, you just throw that to the dogs. Okay, now, in verse 29 through 31, we realize that there is a a sense of what's going on here that speaks to this whole idea of the firstborn. And as it says there in verse 29, you shall not delay the offering from your harvest and your vintage. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. All right, now, why does he say don't delay? Remember the first harvest, is something that was observed on the Pentecost. That was the observance of respect. And what do you do with it? And what are you doing when you give God your first part of your harvest? You're giving him the best. What else? What are you showing? What are you demonstrating? Relying on God. You got it from God. Okay, now why do you have to be told to don't delay? Yeah, we can easily put things off, it might be the last on the list. It says, go ahead and do it when you know you're supposed to do it. Don't say, kind of a rough week. I'll wait and I'll get to it later. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry, Whisker. Did you have your hand up? Okay, good. It's all right. All right. This whole offering your firstborn male has always fascinated me because you don't see a lot of demonstrations of it. But there is the story of Hannah, who was doing what? Was she having trouble having a child? Yes. And so she prays to God. Her husband has a handmaid, and she's been able to have some children. How's that making Hannah feel? She feels terrible. And Elkanah says, look, I treat you better than anyone would treat a wife. And how did that make her feel? It didn't help much. So she made a promise to God. The promise to God was what?
Give me a son and I'll put him in your service.
Okay, Dave said, give me a son and I'll put him in your service. I'm not sure how this always worked, but every time I read about this, I'm trying to imagine myself being her. And eventually, she is able to be with her son for a while. Her son is Samuel. And, but eventually, she leaves Samuel in care of the priest. I think it's Eli. All right, now, so I guess the question I have there, and you can go to 26, 1 through 11, but would that have been a difficult thing to do? I kind of go both ways on this. It's like, oh boy, God gave me a child. This is a great thing. I really don't deserve this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and give him whatever God wants, I'm going to give it to him. And that's exactly what he does. But going back to the delay that I was talking about, do you see how giving God what God really deserves can be something that we might be a little less inclined to say, this is something I really want to do or should do? I think it would have been very easy for a woman like Hannah to just say, if she weren't the kind of person that she was, she could have easily said, well, God, I think you understand. I have not had a child, and now I have that child, and I have that son. I know you'll understand if I don't give him back to you. That to me would be the logical thing. But what we find out is, and I don't know, it may have been true. We don't really get the sense of reading in places where this was happening, across the board. But this was a very real situation. God has provided you things, crops, whatever it may be. You give him the best not because God's selfish or because God needs it or because the Levites need it per se. It's because you should demonstrate to God that you know where it all came from.
Samson didn't have a razor put through his head, so that was kind of where he stayed home the whole time, but he was still dedicated to God.
Yeah, right. it kind of would demonstrate itself in certain ways, different ways, right, Dave? Yeah. Okay, well, anyway, go ahead, Mark. Okay, and then we'll finish it up.
I think the book of Matthew, 25th chapter, talks about how we, as a congregation, are now brothers and sisters in Christ. We're supposed to give to one another, and as we give to one another, we are actually doing what God wants us to do because it's God.
Right.
So, I mean, to take advantage of, the poor, the orphan, the stranger, when they're at a total disadvantage is not even a Christ-like gesture.
Yeah, it's nothing that fits the character of God. And so that's why, as we look, because what did he say? You shall be holy men to me, so act like it. Okay, thanks a lot, guys. I'll have the study sheets for next Sunday out there on Wednesday, Lord willing. Thanks a lot.